Chapter 10. It rose from shadow and became shadow again. At the far end of the attic, the silhouette sat upright and completely still between the two sides of the angled roof. Crowded and lightless, the place it occupied pooled with darkness above and below the moving torch beams, which seemed frail in here, powdery at their furthest reach, but strong enough to pick out the dust and silvery webs on an old black hide. In the patches of hair moistened by drops of rain from the roof beams, it glistened. One beam of torchlight dropped into the area from which the figure emerged. A small wooden casket, the size of an infant's cradle, revealed itself in the dusty yellow underwater light. A coffin, possibly, built from wood and dark with age, or painted black. The other torch, Luke's, lit up the horns that rose from above the two dark eye sockets. Brownish bone, long and thick. Two thin rear legs, ending in hooves, jutted out from the body, then bent at the bony knee joints. The hooves looked as if they were poised upon the sides of the casket, in readiness of the horned thing rising out of its box. Black lips were pulled back above long yellow teeth, a grimace to last for all time beneath nostrils that still appeared curiously wet. Up and down the chest, small pink teats parted the fur. This was the most unpleasant thing of all, worse than the ivory mouth which Luke imagined was about to open and then snap shut with a clacking sound. The thin black forelegs or arms were raised to shoulder height and bent at the elbow. Blackened hands were upturned, the palms facing the ceiling, as if it were commanding all before it to rise, or as if the figure had once been holding objects that were now long gone. Luke couldn't speak, did not know how to react or what to think. He just existed before it and within the terrible presence that filled the cramped space of the attic. Hutch only spoke after he began picking out the pale objects on the floor with his torch beam. Bones. Looking down, Luke saw the dead things, scattered about the wooden casket as if dropped after the flesh had been eaten from their tiny bones. Rabbits, perhaps, and large birds with broken wings and papery skulls. Some of them were still covered with a hairless gray parchment of skin. Over there. Hutch shone his torch at the scratch marks on the timber roof. Cut deep into the wood were childlike symbols and circles, like on the rune stones they had seen in Gammelstad. The inscriptions appeared randomly, at different heights and on some beams, in long lines like Chinese script. What? Luke could not finish the sentence. Questions seemed foolish. How would any of them know what this meant or why it was here? Hutch walked forward. Luke flinched at every step his friend made, as if he were provoking something terrible and sudden to happen just by moving. Things crunched under Hutch's feet. Holding his torch higher, Hutch then cast light onto the torso and the face of the upright thing in the box. If it moved, my heart would stop. Go? Looks like it. Jesus. Quite the opposite. I don't get it. Who would? Some kind of temple? Effigy or sacrifice? I reckon it's supposed to be the goat Mendes. What? This thing is stuffed at the back here. Hutch leaned inward and Luke held his breath. The mice have had a go. Luke shook his head. What do we do? Madness. Hutch was talking to himself. Just imagine the craziness of the fuckers. Luke wasn't sure what Hutch meant. Little hands are human, mummified, stitched on. Hutch turned to Luke. In the illumination from Luke's torch, Hutch's eyes shone. Just mad as hatters. Crosses on the walls downstairs and a bloody goat on the loft. A dead man's hand sewn on, mixing metaphors, lunacy, Swedish lunacy, as the darkness and the long nights send anyone mad. Luke turned. Let's go down. Phil was right. It is a bed. You're messing with me. Hutch shook his head. I've seen them in the housing museum at Sankten. The first time I came over, and in Norway. They used to build these things, little wooden box beds into the rooms, then fill them with hay. You put a lid on it, and it becomes a bench during the day. The people must have been tiny back then. Who'd want to lie in that? This guy. Hutch grinned. and shone his torch right into the goat's leering face. "Hi!" It was Dom calling out from the foot of the stairs. "H!" Hutch nodded at the staircase. "Come on, let's split." Luke resisted the temptation to take the stairs to the ground floor in 2 bounds. Behind him, the flash of Hutch's camera lit up his retreat. Chapter 11. "You couldn't make this up," Dom said. His words were slurred after drinking the lion's share of the Jack Daniels. Supped from their plastic mugs after they'd eaten half of the remaining food, the last 4 tins of sausage and beans, preceded by a first course of powdered chicken soup with noodles. 2 chocolate and oat cereal bars each completed the meal. But it wasn't enough. Despite gulping at the soup and then stuffing the steaming beans into their mouths, even licking the bowls clean, which they had never done before, they remained hungry. This had been the most demanding day so far, even though a shorter distance had been covered than on the previous day. Phil's feet were bare and glistening with antiseptic. Dom's swollen knee was raised and supported under Hutch's rucksack. All of their thighs were stiff with slowly pumping aches, and their lungs were flat with exhaustion. A coma of tiredness had swept through all of them the minute their sleeping bags were unrolled. Luke had never felt so beaten, had not known it was possible to become so heavy in body and so listless. He could take about 1 more day of this. Phil and Dom looked like this had been their last. Enough food for 1 more day outdoors remained, and only a tea-colored trickle was left of the small whiskey bottle Dom had lugged around ever since leaving Gallifrey. It was to have been a treat, open beside some lake of an astonishing Nordic blue, around an open fire, with the sky turning pink as the darkness of night approached. That had been the plan. Luke watched Hutch push the last leg of the stool through the door of the iron stove they were huddled around. A shower of sparks erupted inside as he rooted the ancient wooden spoke around the hearth. They coughed in the acrid smoke that belched out. The chimney was almost totally closed. Smoldering remnants of the seat formed the base to the red ashes inside the little oven had only heated part of the ground floor, before the drafts from the door and between the floorboards took over with a night chill, a tang of damp earth, and the ferment of rotten wood. Phil and Dom had smashed the stool to firewood earlier, against Luke's wishes. Aren't we in trouble enough? And he'd been unable to watch Hutch start the fire using 4 of the crucifixes as tinder. By not watching Hutch snap and twist them into small bundles, he quietly hoped he was exempt from the further misfortune this act of desecration might evoke. Hutch frowned at Dom, then leaned back against his friend's knees. "Go easy on the sauce, Domja. It's got to go 4 days. That's your last tot. I've barely had a mouthful." Phil smiled to himself. "We could save 1 last swig for when we leave the forest." "I'd see it off for tonight. It's the worst thing you can drink if you're wet and cold." Hutch seemed to stop himself from saying anything further, as if what he had suggested might befall them the following day. Sitting and leaning forward on top of their unrolled sleeping bags, which in turn were placed into their foam mats on the filthy floor of the hovel, they consumed the hot red air that belched from the tiny door. Even when they got too close and it burned their faces and seared their heavy eyes, they welcomed it. It was the first heat they had felt in 2 whole days. Above the stove hung from a tent guy's rope, fixed between 4 of the nails that had once held animal skulls in place. Sodden clothes gradually steamed and smoked dry in the darkness. 4 bedraggled fleeces and 4 pairs of grimy trousers. Their waterproof coats were hanging beside them on the nails of the far wall. Everything else had gone damp inside their packs, but was haphazardly suspended from other nails about the room. Dom had taken all the skulls and crucifixes down, something else that made Luke uneasy, though he wasn't sure why. He felt the warmth of the whiskey rise from his belly and numb his mind. It was worn out anyway, and grateful for this cushion of temporary oblivion, or at least the promise of it. In the swimming gloom where the backdrop of the ancient blackened timbers disappeared beyond the reassuring glow of the flames, Luke was struck by the wear on the three faces around him, lit up by the reddish flicker. His own must look the same. Patches of Dom's unshaven jaw shone silver in the glow from the fire. He was going gray. Even his fringe was salt and pepper now. Deep shadows gathered under his eyes, too. They looked too old for his face. He had 3 kids to look after, and a big mortgage to pay. He'd not mentioned anything in any detail about his current circumstances, but said, "Great, never been better," when Luke asked him, "How's things?" during the small talk of that first evening together in London. But the absence of specifics might be the clue. Other than a brief conversation about schools he exchanged with Phil on their first afternoon in Stockholm, Dom had not mentioned Gael, his wife, once. The bone-thin and unhappy woman Luke had met for the first time at Hutch's wedding. Something was up, he could feel it. Dom had been blind drunk the day Hutch got married, and the night before they left for Sweden, again in Stockholm, and then at Galviar before the hike. In fact, at any opportunity he coerced the others to start drinking heavily, something Luke didn't have the wallet for in London, let alone Sweden. He barely scraped enough together to cover his share of the walking holiday, and secretly suspected Hutch suggested camping in the first place so he could be included in the reunion. But despite his bluster and boisterous approach to everything, Dom was acutely sensitive. Luke wasn't fooled. He remembered how quickly he fell to pieces after romantic setbacks when they were students, all living together at number 3 Hazelwood Terrace in Birmingham, the best days of his life. Of all their lives, he'd like to think. And before this trip, he couldn't even remember Phil's face looking anything other than pink and shiny, like it had just been scrubbed. But his cheeks looked jowly now, and his usually florid face was blackened with dirt. An inflamed scratch arched above an eyebrow. Occasionally, Phil would reach up and touch it with a neat fingernail. His white blonde mop of hair had lost its boyish luster, too. It was still thick, but had plastered itself into his scalp with sweat and rain and not revived itself indoors. Around his mouth and eyes, Luke noted the deep lines that looked like slices cut into fresh pastry. It had taken Phil most of the evening to warm up when they met in London. He'd shown up with a long face and a voice both deep and muttery. He'd hardly spoken until they were all drunk at around 10, but it had been his girth, the middle-aged spread, that had given Luke a brief shock when seeing him at Hutch's wedding for the first time in 12 months. It was something he still had not gotten used to when they all hooked up in London before the trip. Stretching his blue work shirt taut, Phil's hairy white stomach had been visible, and his arse looked bulbous enough to suggest the feminine. They were all supposed to have exercise before the trip. Phil and Dom hadn't made any effort at all. But Phil had really let himself go. Once the biggest peacock of them all, the man's style had completely gone now. His jeans were pulled far too high these days, and his socks were visible to the ankle bone. He didn't care anymore. But why? Phil was loaded. He had made a killing as a property developer in West London. He'd won the career lottery, so why the long face? His wife, Michelle, that was why. Luke was certain. Michelle was nuts. They all knew it. She'd been high maintenance when Phil had met her in their final year at university. Great looking, but difficult. Eating disorders, a manic pissed, and violently jealous. Luke remembered her as tall and difficult creature with long bony feet and hands. What had Phil been thinking? But he'd still gone ahead and married her after graduation. And now they had 2 daughters and a big house in Wimbledon. Private school fees, 2 cars to run, an apartment in Cyprus, practically a second mortgage, and council tax. And according to Hutch, they hated each other. Luke had never been to their house, never been invited in the 10 years he'd lived in London. Michelle didn't like him, didn't like what he represented, or so he assumed. Single and still living like a student, a man with no clear goals or purpose as she perceived him. A dreamer, a loser. Everything Phil's wife despised, but maybe feared too as a source of temptation to her husband. Some of her disapproval must have rubbed off on Phil. He was harder on Luke's lifestyle, and more disparaging about his patchy work history than the others. Phil always made a point of making him feel small when money was involved. He'd been listening to his wife too much. A hypocritical stance it was anyway, as Phil never stood his ground or chipped in for a cab fare whenever they met. He'd even stiffed them on 3 rounds in Sweden since they'd arrived. The other 2 didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they weren't bothered, but it stung him. With all his money, Phil still wouldn't buy his mates a drink. It seemed to take every opportunity to joke about Luke's perilous finances. Or did Phil know that Luke had slept with Michelle a year before he'd met Phil? In fact, he seemed to remember introducing them to each other, but he'd been intimate with the girl who was now Phil's wife, and decided against seeing her again the morning after the Easter ball, 16 years ago. But he could still recall her hissing beneath him, like a cat, not to mention the way she rolled her eyes back until they were white when she came. Shamefully, after he ejaculated, he had not only struggled to find anything to like about her, but realized he actually disliked her. Only Hutch seemed to be in great shape, and he was the eldest. He climbed, scuba dived on sunken wrecks in the North Sea, and mountain biked everywhere back home. He was ranked nationally in the Masters Mountain Biking League and ran his own bike shop out of Hemsley. Last year he'd run the Paris Marathon. But even though he'd found his friend's shelter, built them a fire, and promised to lead them out of this godforsaken place by noon the following day, Luke could tell Hutch was troubled. He kept up the barrier and camaraderie since they'd returned from the room upstairs, made sure his humor and enthusiasm for adventure and adversity rubbed off on nervous Luke and the 2 fat men. But if Luke wasn't mistaken, Hutch was anxious, if not afraid, and that worried Luke more than his own suspicions of the house and the forest. Phil shuffled about on his sleeping bag. "I'm so tired I can't see straight, but I don't imagine I'll get a minute's sleep here. My house is already boozed." "There's a bed upstairs if you want it, Phil," Hutch suggested, then took a sip from his mug. To which they all grunted their approval at the display of sick humor. Dom stared into the fire. "Do you think anyone will believe us about this?" "I have photos," Hutch said. "Got a smoke on you, Luke's?" "Not one of the thing in the tree," Dom said with such a serious facial expression. Luke began to laugh as he lengthened an arm with a cigarette pinched between 2 fingers, which set off Phil too, chortling and wheezing. Hutch smiled and accepted the cigarette from Luke. "We can go back in the morning if you like," he winked. "I'm sure you kids would like to see it from all angles." "You could frame it," Phil said, his face relaxing into a smirk and his eyes twinkling by the light of the red flames. "Do you think it's connected to here?" Luke looked at the floor as he asked all of them the question. "I'm trying not to connect the 2, Phil said, "especially as we have to spend the night in one of the places under consideration." As they all laughed at this, Luke suddenly felt his body suffuse with a warmth of good feelings for his friends, maybe even love. He winced at his vow to never see Phil again and at his outburst at Dom. It was just a situation. It had made them all emotional, irrational. "What do you think?" Dom asked. Luke looked at him, his eyes narrowed to meet what he felt was a sarcastic challenge. Dom smiled. "No messin'. What do you really think?" Luke shrugged and raised his eyebrows. "I don't know. I cannot think of any reasonable explanation as to how an animal completely eviscerated, because that's what it was." The 3 faces around him grew grim, so he altered the tone of his voice and made it sound more confidential and lighter. "Gotta be hanging from a tree, so high up. I don't know anything about this area or the wilderness of Sweden other than what I've read online or in the travel guide. H is the real expert here." Hutch sighed. "I wouldn't say expert." Dom rubbed his hands up and down Hutch's head from both sides. "Neither would I, Herksher bastard." "But," Luke said, "don't you have the feeling—" "What?" Dom asked. "That it's all just wrong." Phil laughed. "No shit, Sherlock. Just imagine you weren't lost and you were just walking through this wood on a day trip." Dom burped. "It's a nice but cruel idea at this point in time." "It would strike you as wrong. It would make you uneasy, don't you think?" Luke noticed Hutch was watching him intently as he spoke, but he couldn't read his expression. The actual environment, the trees, the darkness, it's not like any forest I've ever been inside. I've been in a few. I've been camping with ancient Wales and Scotland and Norway, and nothing has ever felt like this. The other forest we saw the first day up here wasn't the same either. It wasn't so rotten and lightless. The others all watched him in silence. Apparently, we're all programmed at a primal level in that reptilian brain to fear the woods. But it's more than that. I felt since we entered this forest, this fear isn't unjustified. Luke took a final long pull on his cigarette and then threw the butt through the tiny door of the stove. Shot, Hutch said. Shot, Dom muttered. Shot, Phil said through a yawn. Luke leaned back into the palms of his hands, and his head was immediately swathed in the colder air that pooled behind their tight circle about the stove. He looked up at the ceiling. Now this. The forest made these people crazy, because I don't think people are supposed to come here. And usually they don't, Dom murmured, his eyes closed. That's why there's no path, see, Yorkshire? Hutch sighed and rubbed his filthy face. I have to say, I've never seen anything like it before. It just suddenly changed, and it wasn't dense enough at first to ward you off, but then it just kind of swallowed us, and there's no going back to the way we came in. He yawned. I really don't want to be here anymore. That's good to know. Thanks for sharing. Dom pushed Hutch off his legs and stretched his body out lengthways in readiness for sleep. Blasted heath, Luke said, smiling. Cursed wood. Phil stood up. I need a piss. He stumbled away, his feet booming on the floor. He disappeared into the annex where the rusty tools are stored. Oh, please, Luke said, more horrified than he sounded. Fillers, you weasel, Hutch cried out through his giggles. Outside for shit, Dom added. Not taking a shit, Phil said, his voice muffled in the darkness. Yet? The Hutch and Dom exploded into laughter. Luke shook his head, fighting a smile that ached around his mouth. Can't believe you are my friends. Burning furniture and crucifixes and now pissing indoors. Totally unacceptable behavior for fathers and husbands. Dom sat up to unzip his sleeping bag. Tell me where you've done it. I need to go too. We might as well piss on the same spot. When Phil and Dom were lying down inside their sleeping bags, Dom snoring within minutes, Phil wheezy but motionless, Luke remained awake and propped up on one elbow inside his own sleeping bag. Hutch lay concealed in a funnel of red nylon that tapered down to his feet, but stared wide-eyed at the fire he'd replenished with as much dry wood as he could shave from the walls before they all turned in. H. Forgive me for speaking out loud, but what is the plan? Hutch turned his head and grinned. I haven't got a clue. Hutch laughed quiet. Luke laughed quietly. It's not been without merit, this trip. We can dine out on it for years. This place is off the scale. Which is no exaggeration. But if the sun's been shining and it hasn't been raining, I have to ask myself if it would look half as terrifying as it does. Luke nodded. I still think it would. Hutch yawned around a smile. Me too. Launching up his last set of unworn and dry clothes inside his pack, Luke fashioned a pillow behind his head. He tried to shuffle closer to the stove without disturbing Phil, but ended up in a fetal position. I had this freaky idea earlier when we were upstairs. Luke knew the idea would be unwelcome to the ears of anyone still awake, but could not stop himself thinking out loud. That thing upstairs was a representation of the thing that threw the carcass into the tree. I heard that, Phil said sleepily. Hutch snickered. It was a shock to be sure, but we all know. He winked at Luke. Things like that don't exist. More is the pity. But it's amazing what the mountaineers will think they've seen when they're oxygen deprived. Sailors lost at sea, exhausted soldiers, same deal. Become detached from the familiar, and our ancestral imagination tries to work shit out. Isolation, long winter darkness, that's what did this. He looked at the ceiling. Someone lost their mind for sure out here. I think I would too. This place has put an end to my long-held fantasy about living alone in a cabin in the woods. But the thing in the tree... Hutch yawned, his eyes half closed. Animal, we're not wildlife experts. For all we know, that's something bears do. Larder or something, like you suggested. Anyway, I better turn in. We can embellish to our heart's content once we're out in that tourist hut by the river tomorrow. Luke nodded. Sure, sweet dreams. Chapter 12. Sticks, spiky cheeks, looking for eyes, poking the throat. Sticks, bristling phalanxes, needling from branches and erupting from the ground. Sticks everywhere. Into the dark, throwing your weight forward, head down to protect your face, arms flung out, fingers grasping for purchase to seize handfuls of sharp sticks and tug them aside. But down sleeves, inside your collar, and into your socks to catch the barbs. Go the sticks, and they bring you to a thrashing suspension, your feet never finding the ground, because you cannot feel the earth, the dark clay from which all of it springs, down through cracking bracken, sharp brown thorns, and crunching dead wood. Your feet plunge, buried to the knee in small crevices from which you cannot haul slow spent legs, and there you hang, gulping at the air like a man drowning, dizzy with exhaustion, weary like the dying. You hang between the bindings of vine and the scaffolding of sticks, and wait for it. Loping through the complete darkness that begins a foot from your eyes, its stride covers thickets you cannot even crawl through. Sweat cools from your neck down to your waist and turns to shivers. Will it be quick? The end? You haven't seen it, but the darkness transmits images at you, composites from a thing you have seen elsewhere at another time, so maybe the horns will go through you, a puncturing thrust to the dense meat of torso before a furious shaking, before the teeth get busy, sharp yellow teeth, old ivory snapping shut with a woody sound, some teeth long for ripping, gleaming wet from black dog gums. So keep your eyes closed at the end. You won't want to see such a mouth up close, before the bite, before its oblivion and the goring of your soft parts. The speckled lips will curl back in a whiny of excitement. You just know it. It comes. You can hear it. The bellow of a bullock showing it to a nasal whine. A puff of air shot through wet nostrils. A doggish grumble, and you can almost see the jaws part before the growl soars through the octaves to become a devilish yip 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 that has circled you for hours. And the solitary hunt, driven wild by the salty minerals of your fear hanging in the cold air, and the expectation of gouting blood, the hot rush to bathe the black snout, and you sense it tensing into a final stalk. Now you scream into the darkness, above, behind, forward, and below. Scream until your throat rubs and rusts. Scream at the futility because there is no one to hear. The air about you stills, or even disappears into a vacuum of anticipation. In your imagination, behind closed eyes, its flanks and haunches are hardening to muscle, tough as ship's rope. Forward comes the long neck, through the dark, through your mind. Out go two mottled spears of bone, black horn, stained and flaking from the last kill. A final rasp of fetid air, bestial and hot with spoiled meat, engulfs you from behind. Air that becomes a shape so long and powerful, and terrible unseen presence sets fire to every one of your nerves and limb and spine, one more time. To fuel your last thrashing plunge into the sticks, the skewers, arrows of wood, hard as bone, sticks everywhere. Awake, into the darkness with a whimper, shuddering as if you just climbed from cold water, your lungs pumping, sucking down that kind of air that gathers for decades beneath old houses, tainted by mildew-softened wood and the dunes of dust in lightless spaces. Where are you? The air moves about your face, or does it? Bruised, your back and shoulders hurt against the wooden floor on which you lie looking up into the dark. Moving your arms, you make a rustling sound. The sleeping bag. It's the sleeping bag that is rolled from the foam mat to the dirty wooden floorboards and ruffled around your knees. Gasping, you sit up. The palms of your hands touch the gritty wood beneath your body. Luke. My name is Luke, and I'm on the floor of the house. the one we found in the black wood. His breathing slows down, he stops panting. The sticks are gone, and he's not being chased. It was just a dream, nothing more. But his skin feels sore all over, like it's been scratched from so many brambles, thorns, and trees with bark like the barnacled hulls of old boats. Must be from yesterday. From the long, delirious, and exhausting trek through the wet forest that never ends. He looks about the room and sees a ruddy glow from inside the stove and remembers Hutch lighting it the evening before. Hard to tell what time it is with the windows shut and tight, the doors closed, and no light filtering down from the staircase from that windowless attic. Where's his watch? And where are the others? About him, in the thin ruby light, he can see 3 empty sleeping bags, all strewn about and open beside backpacks and the debris that had spilled from them. Staying still, too afraid to move, he listens, strains his ears and sends his hearing out and into the darkness. And there it is, a sound so faint but still distinguishable from the patter of rain upon the walls and the occasional creak coming out of this broken home in a wet world. Sobbing. Someone's crying. Upstairs. He looks into the indistinct ceiling and swallows the fear that is tightening his throat. Chapter 13. On your knees you weep, sobs rack your chest, and your eyes are cried dry. Parched heaving comes out of your raw throat. It sounds strange to your own ears. Your cry, because this is the end. Your life closes this way, in the dark and stinking place that makes no sense. There is no justice in this at all, and no way to escape. But your anguish does not penetrate it at all. Sitting there on its haunches, on that wretched wooden throne, the long horns rising majestically to the ceiling like some crown as it watches you, without mercy, empowered by your disgrace on these dirty planks, its arms are flung to the ceiling in hideous triumph. Your underwear is wet through, your thighs sticky. Someone calls to you from behind. Hutch, Hutch, mate, what is it? Where are the others? The voice sounds familiar, but Hutch cannot respond because it's too late. He must wait here for his end. Not long now. A hand on his shoulder, shaking. Wake up, Hutch. Wake up. It's a dream. Hey, it's a dream. You don't know where you are. Wake up now. It's over. Come on, mate. Hutch raises his head, keeping his eyes down and away from that awful black shape before him. He looks up and toward the voice, feels the dry, salt crack on his dusty cheeks. Luke. The recognition of a familiar face makes his own face screw up, tears that would have fallen if there were any left. His mouth tastes hot and briny from sobbing. But why? Why is he here in his boxer shorts, shivering in the darkness with a wet lap, weeping? He was going to die. After being scared for a long time, Hutch squeezes his eyes shut and forces his recollection of the dream from his thoughts. Foolishness creeps through him, warming his cheeks and skin. What the hell? He turns to look at what terrified him. In the gloom, faintly lit from some chinks in the ceiling, he sees its outline, long limbs and horns, a bloody taut with expectation. But it's not alive. No, it's an animal, stuffed and mouse-eaten, some remnant of lunacy abandoned in a decrepit attic of a forgotten house. He looks up at Luke and shakes his head. Luke looks down at him, his eyes full of confusion and fear. We need to get out of here, now. Hutch nods and reaches out to steady himself against his friend, who holds him beneath an arm and pulls him to his feet. The others, Luke says. We've got to find the others. Chapter 14. They found Dom outside, kneeling in the long, wet grass, wearing just his underwear and a t-shirt, watching the trees with glassy eyes. His whole body shivered in the dawn chill. Neither of them could touch him. Hutch and Luke had never seen him look this way. Lips dark and a dirt-streaked face, bleached of color beneath the filth by the cold and by what he had seen, or dreamed of, like them. Dom's face was oddly pink, too, at the sides of his eyes, where his tears had cleansed a hot and salty path down his unshaven cheeks. He was unaware of them, was just motionless and mumbling to himself, with the other two shivering beside him. coming down from their own shock and trying to keep it together. Tousle-headed and wild of eye, Hutch and Luke could not help but follow Dom's stare to see what he had found out there in the dark trees, but they saw nothing but black wood, dripping greenery, and the whitish glimmer of birch bark, all struggling from the choked forest floor. Hutch spoke first. Domja? He must have heard Hutch, because without turning his head, he said, "It's going to put us up there, in the trees." It could have just been gibberish that Dom had brought with him from his sleep, but for a while no one spoke, until Luke turned to face the house. "We've got to find Phil." Chapter 15. Phil was found in the larder, standing up but cowering naked in a corner of the filthy cramped space. Almost luminous in the shadows, his heavy body had withdrawn itself away from their presence in the doorway. His eyes were locked onto something that was not there, as if it was behind them, and slightly above them at the same time. But as his expression was rigid with such an intensity, they were all still tempted to look up and behind themselves, to see what it was that their friend saw. Both of Phil's arms were raised, but there was something indecisive about the position of his hands. Perhaps he had lifted them to ward something away, but the supporting limbs had become weak as the hopeless idea of defense struck him. "Phil? Mate? Come on, let's get you sorted." Hutch had recovered enough from his own trauma upstairs to approach Phil, wary, slow, but confident. Phil's lips trembled like a child's in the middle of fright. His voice was too low for words to be heard. When Hutch touched the fingers of one hand, Phil whimpered and dropped his head between tense shoulders. "It's all right, mate." Hutch held Phil's hand and gently led him from the annex. The smell of stale urine on damp wood came out with him. He was covered in his blue waterproof by Dom, huddled out by the door of the hovel by Hutch, and taken into the dull aluminum light of early morning. The forest around the wild paddock looked exhausted after the lightning storm, even relieved. Long wet grass and the cold fresh air revived Phil. He came back to them, to the world, with 3 powerful heaving sobs that sounded incongruous, strange, unlike any sound they had heard Phil make in their presence before. And then he was standing before them, blinking, with only the top half of his indignity covered. His forlorn eyes questioned each of them, but he received no answer, no understanding. The other 3 just returned a sense of awkwardness and mystification to him. They could not hold his intense stare for long. Hutch turned back to the hovel. "Come on, let's get packed up." Luke moved ahead of him. "Amen to that." "Wait," Dom said. "What the fuck?" Luke nodded at the hovel. "I told you it was a bad idea. Who knows what we stirred up?" He was about to elaborate, but the thought better of it. Phil and Dom stared at Luke, their faces stricken with a desperation to comprehend what he had just suggested. Hutch paused on the threshold, looked over his shoulder, his face grimed with smoke and dirt. His eyes appeared too big for his dirty face. "It'll be time to talk about it when we're terracing out of here." Chapter 16. "How about here?" Dom leaned forward, his arms hurriedly pulling at the undergrowth, trying to move saplings and nettles aside to find a section of the dreary, silent forest clear enough for them to walk through. The remnants of the path had brought them here, continued out of the clearing due north, in the opposite direction they needed to take. The tension among the others, their very desperation to get away from the house fast, seemed to bustle all about Hutch's body and get inside his thoughts. Mostly he just avoided their eyes as he searched about for a solution in silence. Again they were thwarted. Needed to move out in a southwesterly direction to correct the easterly drift along the path the evening before. The edge of the forest and the thinnest band of trees on the map could not be more than 6, maybe 7 kilometers away, but only if they followed a southwesterly route, then turned due south at some point. There was no way he was going to start the day by leading them north. He reckoned Dom had half a day's limited mobility left in his bad leg. "Hand me the machete and we'll make a start," Hutch said, at the south side of the paddock, further along the tree line from Dom. "Then where?" Dom's voice broke into a shriek. How the bloody hell do we get out of here? On the western side of the clearing, Luke jogged over and stood behind Hutch. Anything? Hutch pulled his torso back from behind a dead spruce tree. Nothing over here. It's all debris, full of snags and logs. Even the standing trees are dead. Can't see further than 15 feet. It's worse than anything we saw yesterday. Like it built up overnight, he was tempted to say out loud, in the spirit of the paranoid frustration they were all directing into him. We'll never force a path through. We could try, but we'd move about 10 feet an hour. Dom seized a handful of dwarf willow and yanked at it, his teeth set in a grimace. Why? Why is it like this? A branch bent to him, then stopped moving, burning his hands and greening them with watery sap. Dom dropped the branch, but kicked it uselessly at it with his good leg, then winced in pain. Shit! What about that right to roam bullshit you showed us back home? Who can roam through this crap? It's virgin forest. What? It's bloody dead, H. There's nothing virginal about it. Hutch looked at Luke's tired face. Lucas, toss a fag. Luke handed Hutch his pack of camels. Hutch leaned into the flame of the Zippo, took a long drag, then wiped at the sweat on his forehead before inspecting the back of his hand and wincing. Some of those shit just bit me. Gnats. It wasn't so wet I'd set a fire to the bitch, Dom said. His hands on his knees, his face a picture of hopelessness. Burn our way out. The whole bloody place should be scorched earth. Hutch sighed through a cloud of fragrant smoke. He looked at his hands. The tips of his fingers were still trembling. He swallowed. It's never been managed. There's never been any clear cutting. That's the point. Under the dirt and the rivulets, his tears cut below his eyes the night before. Dom's face whitened with anger. None of them had washed their hands and faces for 2 days. Then why the hell did you bring us in here? We can't bloody walk through it. Never planned for us to get stuck in it. I just wanted to see a bit of it. This far north, something original on the shortcut. It's bloody original, alright. So original, no fucker in the right mind would come up here for a holiday. And few do. Not in this part. Only scientists and conservationists would usually go this deep, I reckon. We're only here by accident. Because of the shortcut. We were only supposed to quickly cut through it. Cut through my ass. We're stuck, H. Trapped like rats. Hutch sighed. Looked for Luke for support, which he had done rarely on this trip, so as not to create the click he'd sensed that Luke wanted. Hutch's voice sounded weak, unsubstantial, when it came out of his mouth again. These national reserves are here to protect the last bit of real biodiversity, Dom. We're the future, just about gone everywhere else. Luke looked about himself, as if seeing it for the first time. Hutch took another drag on his cigarette. He talked himself down from the urgent, instinctive need to just start crashing out southward. A dark silhouette from his dream reared up in his mind, an unpleasant reminder of something he was committing every ounce of mental discipline to suppress. He took a deep breath. This is one of the last parts of the boreal coniferous belt. It goes all the way from Norway to Russia. That's what grew after the Ice Age. It's been around for that long. Norwegian spruce can even live for 500 years. Scots pine for 6. Can you imagine it? It struck by 90% in the last century, all cut down and cleared. But they left parts like this in national parks so fungi and lichen can grow in all of this shit we can't get through. To preserve the habitats for birds and insects, wildlife, this whole place is chock full of rare species. All the forest we saw from the train on the way up is mangled, probably no more than 100 years old. They don't let forests get this old anymore. Momentarily, Luke looked grateful. At least, he always appreciated how much thought went into where Hutch took them. But he always invested himself wholly into anything he organized. Always wanted his companions to see something wonderful. It was his fault they were lost, but even though they were lost, he reminded himself at least they were stranded inside something so few people, even most Swedes, would ever see. Something this old and undisturbed. He thought of reminding Dom of this, then decided against it, because it no longer served as a source of compensation for them either, if he were honest with himself. It's on all the trees, they heard Phil's voice, coming to them across the small clearing about the black hovel they were still trying to escape from. It had been 20 minutes since they had dressed in their grubby, smoky clothes and packed up. Goes in a circle around the house. Luke, Hutch, and Dom all turned to look at Phil on the far northern side of the clearing. He was standing near the thin track that wound outward into the darkness. They all exchanged glances with tight-lipped faces. "What's that, mate?" Hutch called out. "On the old ones, the ones with dead branches." "What's he going on about?" Dom asked. Hutch shrugged. "Guy's really shaken up. Think he's lost it?" "I think we all did last night. If Luke hadn't woken me up, I'd still be up in that attic, kneeling before the goat." Laughter burst from Luke. It sounded too high in the still air and in the enclosure of the trees around the hovel. It sounded inappropriate, like laughing out loud in church. Hutch smiled. "Jesus, boys, are we going to PR this when we get home?" Dom slapped the back of Hutch's head, his face expanding to a tight and forced grin. "We gotta get there first, you useless Yorkshire bastard. Never mind virgin forest and ice age fungus. I want to put my feet back on concrete." Hutch sidestepped the second swat. "Come on, let's go see what the fat man wants." Thank you. That was part 2 of The Ritual. Thank you for listening, and good night.